Hello folks, today I want to tackle a topic that's been the subject of a lot of online speculation over the past half a year or so, which is whether Mario Kart World will ever receive DLC. Now, DLC stands for downloadable content, which is a term that's vague enough to where it could be argued that the minor content updates the game has already received in the past few months actually count. But I think most people would agree that no, when discussing DLC in this context, we're talking about major additions to the game, such as new modes, characters, or even tracks. Whether or not content is paid doesn't factor into its classification as DLC in my opinion, though in this case, given Mario Kart World's already much maligned base price, well, let's hope Nintendo doesn't pull a Nintendo and bring the cost of the game's combined content into the triple digits. Either way, with all of that established, let's get into the video's central question: is it too late for Mario Kart World DLC? Well, obviously, logically, the answer is a definitive no. Just because the game's been out for 7 months doesn't mean it's physically impossible or even extremely unlikely for Nintendo to release DLC for it. The easy example to demonstrate this point is Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and the Booster Course Pass, which released nearly 5 years apart. So who's to say we might not get a Mario Kart World Booster Course Pass or something like that in like 2030? Well, although it's not a meaningless comparison, I do think it's worth considering the circumstances that led to the creation of the Booster Course Pass. As Nintendo's developers themselves explained in an interview, the Booster Course Pass served to fill the Mario Kart-shaped gap that was left in the second half of the Switch generation after Mario Kart World development moved to the Switch 2. If that instead went as planned, and the game came out on the original Switch, circa 2024, I don't think the Booster Course Pass would have been made. This haphazard shift in plans is also likely why the DLC is the way it is. A not super high effort compilation of tracks with models all taken directly from Mario Kart Tour, which only started to feel closer to the original game's quality in the later waves, which the developers likely had more time to work on. That's a pretty big shift from the original Mario Kart 8's DLC tracks, which, if anything, seemed higher quality than some of the base game tracks. And speaking of the original Mario Kart 8's DLC, the way it was handled makes for a perfect counterexample when it comes to Nintendo's DLC release strategy. Although it took nearly a year for both of Mario Kart 8's Crossover Cup packs to be released, they were already announced a few months after the game's launch, meaning they almost certainly started development before the original game was even finished. So if Nintendo is planning on adding more stuff to Mario Kart World in the same way, why wasn't that announced so soon once again? Well, I think there is basically a spectrum of ways DLC can be developed in relation to the original game, ranging from being worked on right alongside the original content to only starting development sometime after the game's release. Mario Kart 8's Crossover Cups are likely an example of the former, and the Booster Course Pass is very clearly one of the latter. And I think the fact that Nintendo's been completely quiet as far as Mario Kart World's post-release content goes since the game's reveal nearly a year ago indicates that if it ends up receiving DLC, that would have likely only started being worked on after the game's release. Now, if we consider Mario Kart World to be what it technically is, a sports-related Mario spin-off, this would go against the formula for DLC that the Switch generation established, since Mario Tennis Aces, Mario Golf Super Rush, and Mario Strikers Battle League all received free DLC updates within the months following each game's launch that slowly filled out their respective content. But if Mario Kart World was following that same format, surely the updates would have already started rolling out. And say what you want about the game, but it does not feel anywhere near as underbaked when it comes to characters or locations as the Switch-era Mario sports titles. There are also the odd cases where DLC was likely already nearly finished when the game originally came out, so it was just sort of awkwardly dropped out of nowhere a few weeks later for way too high a price, even though it would have made the original game feel way more complete if it had been included from the start. But for the most part, Mario Kart World not receiving any DLC more than half a year after its release actually does sort of fit with Nintendo's typical DLC release strategy, since most of the recent examples of major Nintendo game DLC weren't announced before each game's release and didn't come out until a few months or sometimes more than a year later. So based purely on historical precedents, I think it's still almost as likely as ever that Mario Kart World DLC is being worked on or will be made in the future. But saying that ignores a large aspect of this whole conundrum, which is the question of what Mario Kart World DLC would even look like. See, we've talked about Mario Kart 8's two different sets of DLC waves, which both introduce several new cups and playable characters to the game. And despite the fact that the Booster Course Pass editions in particular definitely weren't planned during the original game's development, all of this stuff still slotted into the existing game structure pretty naturally. Adding more tracks to this game is as simple as extending the already existing systems a little further, which even amateurs have been able to figure out. But, well, you can see where I'm going with this. Adding more tracks to Mario Kart World would almost certainly be a comparatively massive undertaking, right? This game's main gimmick, its entire selling point, the thing it's named after, is its large interconnected world that was designed to specifically fill in the gaps between its very carefully curated selection of tracks. So whereas adding any given track to Mario Kart 8 just involved creating its specific layout, environment, gimmicks, and obstacles, adding even one track to Mario Kart World would require, what, extending the game's continent to include another open world portion or something? How would that even work? Mario Kart 8's DLC added 50% more tracks to the game, and the Booster Course Pass then straight up doubled that count. So would more tracks mean Mario Kart World's titular world would be forced to grow even more insanely huge? How about all of the miscellaneous content, like the P-Switch missions that the current world map is already littered with? Are we gonna end up with close to 1,000 of those? Everything in Mario Kart World's current form is designed around the very specific structure of its open world, from the way cups and knockout rallies connect, to how character costumes are unlocked, and even how NPCs drive across the game's roads. People might think the game's open world aspect is uninteresting, but a lot of work clearly went into all of this stuff, meaning it would take almost just as much work to reshape it into something that could accommodate more tracks and other types of content. So what I'm trying to get at here is that I think the odds of this happening, of the game receiving more content that just naturally clicks into place like a puzzle piece onto the existing game, is extremely unlikely. After all, just look at another open-world Nintendo launch title, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which did receive DLC, but not in a way that actually modified the structure of its world. Of course, the developers did eventually reshape this world by slotting more stuff onto it, kind of like what I described earlier, but this became the basis for an entire additional game, not just DLC. So who knows, maybe a few years down the road we'll get a Mario Kart World 2 that adds sky islands and caves to the existing world, and that'll be completely uncontroversial. Okay, jokes aside, getting back on track, so if expanding the open world isn't gonna happen, then what form would additional tracks take? One idea I've seen suggested is that the developers could simply implement additional tracks into the existing world. Mario Kart World's continent features plenty of mostly empty spaces that could be filled with tracks that suit each environment. Like, who knows, this valley could be turned into Yoshi Desert, these cliffs could become Koopa Cape, and that's not to mention potential brand new tracks. However, although this would probably take less work than creating extra open world environments for extra tracks, integrating these new tracks into the game's existing spiderweb of systems would only be more difficult, if anything. How would the P-Switch missions that would have to be deleted to make way for these tracks be handled? What about knockout rally routes, or the existing track structure of the game's current cups? Modifying the current continent to make it feature more tracks would in many ways cause even more issues than expanding the continent and making that work seamlessly. So again, no, I don't think Mario Kart World DLC would involve cramming more tracks into the game's existing environment. Another option that would definitely be possible, though also kind of disappointing in a funny way, would be if the new tracks were simply once again self-contained. This would alleviate all of the problems I've mentioned so far. The cups and rallies and open world content could all stay exactly the same, and all of the new stuff could simply be accessible through a menu, just like all of the content was in previous Mario Kart games. And not only would this make integrating the DLC into the game's existing structure infinitely easier, but it would also simplify the process of having to actually make the tracks. An underrated aspect of Mario Kart World's design is how almost every track environment works both as a normal racetrack and an explorable environment depending on the context of how it's accessed. Making this work not only involved rethinking the structure of most tracks to allow them to be traversed in a variety of ways, but also taking parts of tracks that would normally just consist of simple background assets and turning these into traversable environments as well. But all of this extra work wouldn't be necessary if the developers gave up on the open world aspect of the game for its DLC altogether. In fact, this would be a great opportunity to explore the track ideas that would have almost certainly never worked as an open world playground that would have had to have been contextualized within a larger world. However, of course, regardless of your opinions on the non-racing aspects of Mario Kart World, I think it's undeniable that it would be a bit of a cop-out to just drop this part of the game completely the moment it becomes convenient to do so. Removing the world from additional Mario Kart World tracks would be like removing the anti-gravity from DLC tracks in Mario Kart. Wait, but they did exactly that. Since all of the Booster Course Pass tracks used Mario Kart Tour track models which weren't made with anti-gravity in mind, most Booster Course Pass tracks don't feature the game's main gimmick. And the ones that do only use it in sections that worked perfectly fine without anti-gravity in Mario Kart Tour. And the funny thing is that I don't mind that, just like I don't mind Mario Kart World featuring almost no anti-gravity whatsoever. In a way, the fact that many of the Booster Course Pass tracks are almost just as fun as their twisty-turny counterparts in the original game's cups goes to show that anti-gravity was never a gimmick that made the game much more enjoyable in the first place. So some people, especially those who didn't love Mario Kart World's world, might argue that this game's DLC tracks could prove the same thing in regards to the game's open world aspect. And no matter what, it's hard for me to deny that the exciting thing about the potential of Mario Kart World's DLC to me is racing along the new tracks, not exploring them. Either way, this is proof that Nintendo is more than willing to almost entirely drop a Mario Kart game's main gimmick if it makes developing DLC for that game more convenient. So I think this is a pretty likely scenario for what Mario Kart World's DLC might entail. But there is another obvious compromise that could be settled on instead. What if instead of expanding the game's existing continent, Mario Kart World's DLC instead adds an entirely new second explorable island? It could have all the same stuff the original game's world has. Obviously new tracks, but also new P-Switch missions, beach medallions, question mark panels, maybe even new costumes to unlock, not to mention additional cups and knockout rallies. And there is really very little I can say to argue against this possibility, since after all, it worked in the original game. The only true argument I have against this idea is that it seems insanely high effort. Going back to the Booster Course Pass again for the sake of comparison, the reason the developers were able to make it with relative ease and double the game's track count is because so much of the groundwork had already been laid by Mario Kart Tour. As someone who's made a few Mario Kart 8 tracks myself, I know that a lot more goes into it than simply making the track models, but still, I think if it weren't for the decision to port over the Tour assets, the Booster Course Pass definitely wouldn't have been as big as it ended up being. And making however many tracks worth of open world environment takes even more work than just modeling the tracks themselves. So if this is the option the developers end up going for, if the DLC ends up adding another island, or maybe several, I'm almost certain the amount of actual tracks such an addition would introduce would be relatively low. Now, there's one final thing I want to mention that's become an idea that's almost impossible to avoid when it comes to Mario Kart World DLC speculation, which is the idea that this will involve a crossover with Donkey Kong Bananza. In case you're not aware, the reason people have been holding on to this idea for half a year is because two actors that voice major characters in Donkey Kong Bananza are also credited in Mario Kart World, despite them seemingly not voicing any characters in this game. And when this was first discovered, I remember people being certain that this meant Donkey Kong Bananza crossover DLC would be announced any day now, like maybe around the time Bananza released. Or no, I meant after it's announced during the September Direct. No, that came and went. Okay, well, what about the Game Awards? Wouldn't be the first time Nintendo's announced crossover DLC there? Nope, never mind. Look, I'd be as excited as anyone if this idea did come to fruition, but the time frame of specifically a Bananza crossover DLC making any kind of sense is passing by quickly. As I mentioned in a previous video, it's clear that Nintendo is trying to make Bananza a success as a stepping stone towards making Donkey Kong as a whole one of their flagship franchises once again, but surely with that in mind, if they were planning on doing a Mario Kart World crossover from the very start, to the point where the voice actors had already done some work apparently, why wouldn't they have struck while the iron was hot and released this DLC sometime around the launch of Bananza itself? I suppose the DLC might be used to fill a gap in Nintendo's schedule later down the line instead, but that makes the whole crossover idea fall flat in my opinion. This concept is obviously based on how the original Mario Kart 8 DLC also revolved around crossovers, but those didn't involve promoting any other single specific game, but just Zelda and Animal Crossing as a whole, so that wouldn't fit with the idea of DLC that's specifically themed after Donkey Kong Bananza. There are a lot of ways in which this idea makes so much sense. The aforementioned second open world island could just be DK Island, and since DK and Pauline barely have any costumes in the base game, ones that reference Bananza's outfits could be added as well. But this is Nintendo we're talking about. If there's one thing they're known for, it's avoiding obvious ideas and carving their own wacky, inexplicable path instead. So in my opinion, this idea is becoming less likely by the day. Though in general, I still think it's very likely that Mario Kart World will receive DLC. Nintendo being radio silent on the matter so far is maybe a bit scary, but also falls in line with how they treated additional content for many of their previous games. Assuming they're not planning on releasing a second Mario Kart game on the Switch too, development on a sequel will likely once again drag on for nearly a decade, so it makes perfect sense to fill that space by adding more tracks and maybe characters and other stuff as well to the game in the future. But hey, maybe you disagree, and if so, feel free to let me know by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you'd like to watch one of my videos early, maybe consider signing up for a YouTube channel membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!